Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned your subscription. And of course, to everyone who's watching, if you enjoy this video, I would appreciate it if you would click that thumbs up button. It's free to do. YouTube isn't going to spam you. You're not going to download any malware. But best of all, it will tell YouTube that this video is a good video to watch, and they will therefore promote it to other folks with similar interests. But even more importantly, if you click that thumbs up button, it tells YouTube what kind of videos you like to watch. So YouTube will be more inclined to recommend similar videos and channels that you will find interesting yourself, and you may find yourself encountering videos and channels you never knew existed. So what I want to talk about in today's video is part 6 of my electric violin build. And in part 5, I made the cute little fingerboard. So what I'm going to make today is the neck, and I'll be doing that on the CNC machine. So let me bring you a little closer and I'll kind of walk you through what's going to be happening in this episode. Okay, so back in episode 5, I talked about the techniques that I use for positioning and clamping down the blank that I'm going to carve from, and how I register the blank for two-sided carving. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. I'm just going to kind of briefly touch on the subject. So if you want to know more about how I do that, you can go back and watch episode 5. But in a nutshell, this is the blank that I'll be using to carve out the neck. And I've got a line drawn along its length down the center, and then one across its width at the center, and where they meet up, that is the exact center point of the blank. I've extended those lines down the sides, and on my CNC machine's wasteboard, I have lines that are engraved into the wasteboard, and these lines are positioned precisely from the lower left corner of the workspace. This workspace is 48 inches wide, 48 inches deep. So I have a line that runs the length of the wasteboard at 24 inches from this corner. Then I have a couple of other lines. One is at 24 inches across the width, parallel to the x-axis, and it's exactly 24 inches from this corner. I have another line that's at 18 inches, and I use this one most of the time because it's easier to reach. But where these lines intersect, that is a center point, which is going to correspond to the center point of my blank. So to line it up, I just simply line up these lines that are extending down the sides with the lines that are engraved in the wasteboard. And once I have it lined up, I can clamp it down. I then know that this center point is at a very precise numerical distance from this lower left position on the wasteboard. What I can do now is then home the CNC machine, which is going to move the spindle over and forward until it reaches this lower left corner. And then limit switches that are built in will trip and stop the machine's movement. And that sends a signal to the controller, which you can't see, it's underneath here. And that tells the controller exactly where the very center of the bit or the spindle is with respect to this lower left corner. From here, I can jog the machine manually 24 inches over to this point. And then since this is the forward line, I'll jog it back 18 inches, and that puts it right over the very center point of my workpiece. Now, this workpiece is, I believe it's 20 inches long, 5 inches wide. So what I'll do is I'll jog it forward from this point, 10 inches forward, and then 2.5 inches over, and that will place the tip of the bit right over this very corner. From there, I can use my probe. It's a Z-axis probe, and that's going to probe the bit so that the machine knows exactly how far off the surface of the blank the tip of the bit is. Once I've done that, I have the CNC machine spindle in the XYZ home position, or the start position, for doing the cutting on this side of the blank. Now, once I've finished carving on this side, I'll then flip it over, line it up again with those engraved lines on the CNC machine's wasteboard, clamp it down, and then I can carve the other side and everything will register perfectly. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what's involved. So I'm going to go ahead and start getting things clamped down, lined up, and ready for cutting. Once I have the spindle homed to this lower left corner, I can go ahead and change the bit and install the bit that I'm going to actually use. And for this neck, the only bit that I'll be using is an extra long solid carbide 2-flute spiral upcut bit. It's 1/4 inch in diameter. And this is what I'll use to carve into that deeper, thicker blank. And now what I can do is jog the spindle over to the very center of my blank. And then I'm going to bring the spindle down just a bit because it's a bit too high for probing. And now I'm going to use the probe itself to tell the controller where this surface is. And it does that by bringing the bit down until it touches this brass block, and that closes a circuit which instructs the controller to stop moving the spindle, and then the spindle will back off just a small amount. So now I have the Z-axis home position set. The controller knows exactly how far it is from the tip of the bit down to the surface of the work. So what I need to do now is move the bit, the whole spindle, to the XY start position, which is that lower left corner. One thing I should mention is that the workpiece that I'm cutting from is actually longer than the size of the stock that I assigned in MeshCam when I established the tool paths. The stock was originally intended to be 11 inches in length, which is long enough to accommodate the neck that I'm going to be carving. This board is actually almost 18 inches in length. However, because I'm using these center lines as a way to position the blank, I don't have to cut it to actual size. I just have to know what those dimensions are so that I can precisely numerically jog the spindle from that center point forward to the front edge and then over to the left edge to begin the carving operation from that XYZ home position. Since I assigned the stock to be 11 inches in length, I have to jog the spindle forward 5.5 inches. Then I have to jog it to the left 2.4375. And now the tip of the bit and the spindle itself are in the XYZ start position for this carving operation. Okay, so I realize that this shape that I just carved probably doesn't make any sense right now, but stay tuned and I think you'll understand why. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip the blank over and I'm going to reposition it just like I did earlier with respect to the engraved positioning lines on the wasteboard. And once I have those very precisely lined up, I can clamp it down and begin the process of cutting or making all the carving operations on the other side, which is really going to be the majority of the neck's shape. Now, as a reminder, for those of you who watched the earlier episodes when I was planning this build, this neck is going to be carved in two halves, side by side. Those two halves will then be liberated from the blank and glued together, sort of like a two-piece laminated neck. Now, before I can do anything else, I have to reposition the spindle in the XYZ home position. And since I jogged it out of the way to flip the blank, all I have to do is jog it back. So I'm going to come 16 inches toward me, and then I'm going to drop it down 1 inch. Now I'm in the XYZ start position. Okay, so everything is clamped down. The spindle has been home to the XYZ start position, and I'm ready to start carving on this side. However, before I do that, I wanted to touch on a subject that you don't often hear folks talk about, and that is carving strategies. And I've kind of mentioned this before in the past. Every time I set up a tool path, I try to follow a specific strategy, and it's usually based on the bits that are going to be used, the type of carving that's going to occur, and what the capabilities of the bit and the machine are. And unfortunately, at this time, a lot of the strategies that you have to put into play are based on experience. And that's where a lot of folks get into trouble, where they have bits that are breaking or carves that are failing. They're just not making the right decisions when it comes to determining what their feeds and speeds and depths of cut and all that kind of stuff. And like I said, for now, it's kind of based on experience. However, that is changing. And I think you're going to see in the years to come, the software is going to improve to where it's so much easier to plan a carve and to execute it successfully without the fear of breaking your bits or damaging the part that you're trying to carve. But until then, a lot of what we have to do, especially with really complicated cuts, and I consider this neck that I'm going to carve to be fairly complicated. There's a lot of swirls and curves and turns and contours and that sort of thing. So when I set those tool paths up, I have to look at what I'm going to carve and figure out, or at least anticipate, where there may be problems and what I can do to mitigate those problems. As an example, I'm using a 1/4 inch diameter 2-flute spiral upcut bit. Theoretically, I can push that bit at a very high feed rate and a very deep depth of cut. However, with this particular carving operation that I'm going to be doing, because there's so many turns and curves, and because it's so thick and deep, I run the risk of running into some issues if I try to push the bit and the spindle at its full capacity. So what I have to do is try to figure out strategies to prevent that from happening. And there's a number of things I can do. Without getting into too much detail, what I've decided to do with this particular cut is to sort of dial back some of my settings from what I normally would do. That will hopefully ensure a successful cut. If it doesn't, I'll have to start all over again. Unfortunately, I've got enough maple blanks that I can do that. Of course, I don't want to do that, but if I have to, I will. I'm hoping that this cut will come out perfect. Now, I've made hundreds of guitar necks over the years using not only this CNC machine, but the other two that I had before it. And I have a pretty good idea of what to expect and how to plan for it. But that doesn't always guarantee success when I'm creating a new design that I've never made before, and that's what's happening here. So enough talking, let's start carving. Well, I have to admit, I was a little bit nervous about how this one was going to turn out. And the reason for that was because this carving operation involves a lot of tight curves in a short span. And the problem with that is when you have a machine that has a lot of torque and is capable of running at a very high speed, the forces that are generated between the bit and the wood can be enough to actually move the wood on the wasteboard, even though it's tightly clamped down. So what I had to do was I had to look at the file before I cut it. I looked at the simulations on my computer, and I decided to add a couple of clamps to help ensure that the blank wasn't going to move around as I was carving it. And then I also decided to reduce the depth of cut. So normally I would be cutting equal to the diameter of the bit. So since that's a 1/4 of an inch diameter bit, I would be making my depth of cut a 1/4 of an inch. But what I decided to do instead was to half that to 0.125 or 1/8 of an inch. And that, I think, greatly reduced the stress and the forces generated between the bit and the wood. So in the end, it all seems to have worked out pretty well. I didn't have any issues during the carve. Nothing moved, and everything appears to have cut pretty smoothly. So I think what I can do now is liberate the halves from the blank by cutting the tabs, and then we'll see how well these two halves come together. I might even dummy the fingerboard into place. See, now you can see why I cut those pockets. They're inside of the scroll, and that's in an effort to reduce some of the weight in that headstock area. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and glue these two pieces together, and I'm just going to use regular clamps. I don't have any sort of fancy clamping jig specifically designed for this. Why would I? So what I'll do is I'm just going to use regular Titebond wood glue, and then I'm going to apply just a few grains of regular table salt to one side. And what that table salt will do is it acts like sandpaper, and it will grip the two pieces and keep them from sliding as I apply clamping pressure, because as you know, wood glue can be kind of slippery. So I'm just going to go ahead and apply this on the surface all the way around. It doesn't require a huge amount of glue. I don't have to apply glue to both sides, just this one side. That's all I need to do. Now I'll take some of this table salt. It doesn't take much, just a few grains in a couple of spots. Now I've already kind of rehearsed my clamping layout, so hopefully this will work. Well, I have to admit, this neck looks almost comically small. You know, compared to the necks that I normally make, which are for guitars that have 25.5-inch scale, this neck is just teeny tiny. And it almost looks like it was made for little people. At any rate, this is how it's going to look with the fingerboard glued into place. So you can kind of see what that's going to look like. Now, my goal with this headstock is, since I'm going to be using guitar tuners, I wanted to create a kind of an angled headstock like you would see traditionally on an electric guitar. But then I wanted the end of it to look like it's rolled up onto itself. So it's kind of an optical, well, I shouldn't say optical illusion. It's a sculpted illusion. So yeah, I think it's kind of cool. Kind of fun look to it, so we'll see how it all comes together. But in the next episode, which will be part 7, I'm going to make the body. And the body is going to be made in a similar fashion to how the neck was made. It's going to be 2 pieces, a top half and a bottom half. And then once those parts are cut out, I can then glue them together to form the finished body. So be sure to check back and watch as that body gets carved. It should be pretty cool. So until the next episode, as always, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for part 7.